Okay, I could spend all day talking about these, but there are certain key elements around cash flow, where we spend our money, and how we spend our money that are important for us. Because when you're asked to make certain changes or do certain things, or we change a program or something, or we delay a program because we don't have the cash, you can kind of see where we are in that respect. Questions on these? Make sense? Okay. So we talked about timing on the cash flow. It shows where they go, where it comes and goes. And it tells us really, do we have enough money in the bank to pay the bills? And then the statement of net assets, and it shows us where all of that is reconciled to and how it's restricted. All right, let's talk about some ratios. I want to show you a few key ratios that kind of get into how to further interpret the healthiness of the financial statements. They are the preferred method for gaining an in-depth understanding. They are meant to use as a benchmark because from a credit analysis standpoint, certain ratios for like-sized companies, so you take us and compare us to a CMC in Charlotte, a Greenville Health System, MUSC, any like-sized system, Carillion in Virginia, you name it, right? The investment portfolio people are taking these ratios and they're saying, okay, what's the current ratio for Palmetto? What's the current ratio for Carillion? What's the current ratio for Greenville? And they're ranking it just like we do our clinical data to say you're in the 50th percentile, you're in the 25th percentile, therefore you've got more risk than you do. And that's basically one of the big reasons why these are used, is in that credit analysis process. So they're broken into basic categories. How liquid are we? Are we in a position to meet all of our short-term debt? The salaries we owe, the supplies we owe, basically. Can we pay our bills? How efficient are we in using our assets to produce revenues? This gets into that labor process. It gets into these things we talk about around patient cycle time and so forth around activity. Are we busy enough to justify our investments? Right? So let me give you from a strategy standpoint on that, what's happening in the marketplace around orthopedics care? Outpatient. We are getting beat to death by outpatient processes because they're low cost, low overhead, right? So from an activity standpoint, if we were to measure these ratios against that, would there be enough business to justify continued investment in those areas potentially, and or some brand new procedure that costs, or piece of equipment that costs $10 million? Maybe not. So that's where we get into that strategy process as well around these. Profitability is our bottom line where it should be. What did we see last Thursday? Our bottom line is not where it should be. It's red. Red, negative, or in brackets. And then our capital structure, how are we financed and our ability to take on new debt? Just like you have a loan-to-value ratio on your house when you buy a house, they say, okay, what's all of your other debts? How much income do you make, and what's your revenue stream? And what's that percentile? That's that same process in capital structure for an organization. So they're looking at us, and that's part of why a couple of them are a little nervous, because they're not quite sure where the merger is going to completely go, and then we're still kind of fairly young into the Toomey purchase process on top of that and so forth. So that's where these ratios come into play there. So some key liquidity ratios. One of the most important ones is the current ratio, or current assets to current liabilities. Go back to your balance sheet real quick, and I'll show you kind of how healthy we are in that regard. So go to the not the 9-month one, but the full balance sheet for June 30th to September 16th, 2016. And we're gonna take the there we go. We're gonna take the 2017 number, and we're looking at the one for years ended September 30th, 2017 and 16. Okay, so the full year. So total current assets in 2017 was $444 million, right? So we would take current assets as our numerator and divide that by current liabilities of $196 million, 997. So what is that? from a ratio standpoint? Is that, what is that, greater than, you see what I'm talking about? Okay?
So you said 444.
Yeah.
Our total current.
So the full year, so when you look at current assets, 444, divided by current liabilities, 196,996. All right, now we do 220 liabilities. Got it? 19996. Total current liabilities,
No, that- hold on.
196. What's the number?
I got 2.25.
2.25. So again, from a ratio standpoint, from an accountant standpoint, if I'm looking at this, the healthiness of this company, this is one of, from a liquidity standpoint, I said liquidity is what? Our ability to pay our bills. We have more than twice the amount of current assets we could liquidate to pay those current liabilities than we have current liabilities on the books, right? Make sense? So anything above 2 says that the company is in a very good financial position from a liquidity standpoint. So that's an example of how we use these ratios, and this is one, from an investor standpoint, this is one of the biggest ones I look at, or any investor or accountant looks at in that regard. So that's an example of how we would use that. You've heard me talk about, and Toomey was recognized at LI for this, from a System Excellence Award, right? What have we done around accounts receivable? They've reduced their days of accounts receivable from 90 to 45 or whatever that was. What that means is we're turning cash faster for the amount of money we're owed in revenue and getting more cash in the bank quicker. So this is a very important ratio that we look at constantly. They're trying to get that number down. They should be no more than about 30 to 45 days on cycle from the moment that patient leaves or we earn that revenue till we actually get the payment made and the bill and the money collected. No more than about 45 days is a typical industry standard. So if they're outside of that, from an industry standpoint, if your average AR is, for accounts receivable is 90 days or greater, you have a significant chance that you're going to write it off as bad debt. So that'd be an example of how we use that ratio. Then days cash on hand. I fundamentally told you about we had 2 days cash on hand, fundamentally. That one is not so great. That's why they've worked so hard to try and improve cash on hand on the financial statements. They do not want to have that short number of days pure cash, because if we were to have a real problem, it's going to take some time to liquidate all of those other current assets, right? So that one's one that's not in great position right now. Activity ratios. We look at operating revenue per discharge, expense per adjusted discharge, and then salary and benefits is an expense percent of total operating expenses. Remember I told you salary and benefits is, for us, is about 50% of that total deal, and you said 966 million is the total. And we're about it's roughly a $2.5 billion corporation. So that would be an example of that ratio. How do we compare against other like-sized organizations? Are we heavy on our labor? Or are we about right on our labor, or are we too light? And that's what that ratio is used for. So operating margin. This fundamentally is that target we talk about. When they talk about the NOI or the contribution margin, fundamentally the same as the operating margin or profit margin in that regard. And that's just the formula for how you actually get there. This helps us focus on day to day. And this profit margin, and this is why they harp on it, this is why Mr. Dwayne reports on it, it is the #1 warning sign that we have a problem when we're not hitting that target based on the budget. Then you get return on net assets. How efficiently are we using the assets we have on hand to garner revenue and a profit? And that's basically your ROI. Or if the community is looking inward to the organization, how much value are we bringing back into the community as a not-for-profit from a return on investment standpoint? So when people are looking at the foundation and saying, do I invest in this company? This is one of the biggest things they're looking at, is to say, if I'm going to give you $10 million, what am I getting out of this other than a tax write-off? Because they do get a tax write-off for that. But if I'm going to be a foundational contributor, what is the hospital going to do? Because a lot of times these are corporations or other wealthy individuals that own businesses, obviously, if they're contributing millions of dollars. And in part, they've got skin in the game from an outflow standpoint and or a reputation standpoint about who they're investing their dollars in. And are they going to get the biggest bang for the buck? So if they're competing and they're saying, if I'm going to give up $10 million, are you going to give me the best ROI? Or is Providence going to give me the best ROI? Or is, the University of South Carolina going to be the best return on investment for what they're doing with their assets? Capital structure ratios. How are we financed? Are we able to take on new debt? So this goes to the same process of how you're viewed if you're applying for a car loan or a new house. Can you safely take on that additional debt incrementally and still be able to pay all your bills and come out okay on the end so that they don't have to foreclose on you in that regard? And this is where the statement of cash flows concerned to determine the significant long-term debt. When I showed you Toomey on there, when we spent money on Toomey, that's what I'm looking at right there on the cash flow statement to see, have I bought a new hospital? Have I built a new building? Have I acquired some really expensive piece of capital equipment? And why was it used in that regard? These are a couple of them, long-term debt to net assets. And the way you read these is exactly what it says on the sheets. You're going to see on the balance sheet long-term debt. You're going to see net assets. You're going to see net assets to total assets, right? You're going to see then the debt service coverage is exactly what we talked about, ability to pay a loan. So they add up all your revenues, they look at all of your recurring long-term expenses, and they say, can you pay the loan? All right, we got about 30 minutes left. I can get through the benchmarking fairly quick. Do you want to take a break or do you want to keep on marching?
Yeah.
What's that? March? All right. I love this definition for benchmarking. This is where we're going to start getting into kind of the meat of the matter. I love this because it really talks about what we should be as leaders from this standpoint. It's humble enough to admit that somebody else may be better at something and wise enough to try and learn how to match that and surpass it. This is why I love benchmarking. And now we're going to talk connotatively about the fact that we benchmark with Vizient or work performance standards. But let me ask you this question. Y'all work in service lines. You work comparatively with other hospitals. So Tracy, you've got women's services at Richland Baptist, and you know obviously directors and managers from other facilities. TK, you work in an area that's got, what, 7, 8 departments in the same service line. Heart Hospital the same way to a great extent. Y'all benchmark internally against one another to learn best practice?
We should. We do some. No, realistically, we should more, especially like in a med-surg service.
Yeah.
But we don't as much as we should. But we do to a small extent.
Do we have an internal benchmarking system in place? Actually, we do. Yeah, I'll show you in a minute. You don't think of it as a benchmarking system because we've not given it to you that way.
Okay.
But it is actually a benchmarking system. I look at it all the time, looking for best practice in key areas. Yep, I'll show it to you in just a minute. But I love this. I love benchmarking because remember I said at the very beginning we need to become a learning organization. This is the foundation of being able to learn. And Lou Holtz said it best. I can't respect Lou because he coached at University of South Carolina. Sorry. But he said the best idea is one that's a great idea that you stole and put into practice for your organization fundamentally, right? And that's not completely untrue because benchmarking, as we'll learn, is our ability to learn what other people are doing. Do they do it better than us, or are we actually better than them and we didn't realize that? If they're better than us, what can we do to catch up? So even internally, right? You may learn something from one of your peer managers that you didn't realize they were doing. That's a great practice. We've heard in LI in terms of these different initiatives and practices that were put into place. An example is the NICU where they traded labor so that they wouldn't have to low census people and help the other unit from a best practice standpoint. I gave you an example on 9th Ortho where we discovered something as simple as where the ice machine was from a cycle time standpoint for nurses and so forth. So benchmarking is a very powerful tool. And our real goal, what's our goal at Palmetto? Why'd you come to work at Palmetto? Why do you want to be here? I know why I want to be here. I want to work for the best. Right? And in Columbia, I firmly believe that Palmetto is the best healthcare system, definitely in this region. And with our partnership with Greenville, we have our opportunity to be the best in the southeastern region. There's no reason why we shouldn't be the best nationally, right? That's part of that learning process of how we become the best in our industry. I've worked for nationally recognized EMS systems. I managed one in Wichita, Kansas. And it's a fascinating thing to be able to compare with your peers and learn, and be part of a learning organization that way. Here are some commonly benchmarked performance measures. We've already talked about the financial ratios. Those ratios are get benchmarked comparatively. Productivity. What's our biggest one in productivity that we benchmark? We talk about all the time. Our worked hours per patient day. Benchmarked and busy, right? So we look at a Richland as compared to like-sized facilities. Palmetto, Baptist, Toomey is compared to like-sized facilities, and on down the line, right? Where do we fall out in that regard? So that's an example of productivity ratios. How efficient are we relative to the census loads that are on our facility and the productivity ratios? And we've heard some of the things coming out of the partnership with Greenville about where they are versus where we are in that regard. What are our operating results, our human resource measures? What's the big one in human resource? Retention rates. Retention rates. And you can actually look at other facilities and see what their retention rates are if you wanted to in that regard. Here's a huge one, quality. What's the most poignant one that gets benchmarked that's in the news lately? Leapfrog scores, or safety scores around quality, right?
They're so old.
Well, they're 2 years old, but that's one of the problems with them. But like I told the nurse residents, would you go to a restaurant that has a C rating? Nope.
Not if they're gonna go with an A.
Not if there's one with an A, right?
Well, if the C was 2 years ago and they now have an A sign.
Yeah, but there are some problems, but reliably so in this day of value-based purchasing and new reality of healthcare. Consumers have access to that information, and the media loves to report on it. And it is benchmark data, so they can look at us and compare us to other like-sized facilities. What's our market share in the Columbia region right now? It's about 60% of the market right now. We're in a very competitive marketplace. So do we fit well in our marketplace compared to other like-sized facilities in similar situations or not? And then our structural measure. How much labor input per patient do we have? What's the size of our facilities? All of those different things from a structural standpoint. All of these things can be measured and benchmarked. So let's do a quick input activity. We've had a lot of conversation. But what do we benchmark, and where does that data come from in your mind? Think of some of the things that we benchmark internally and externally, and where does that data come from? We've already talked about it a little bit. Let's talk internally. I've kind of given you a hint. Customer service, our HCAPS, right? Benchmark. And there's another internal benchmarking opportunity, looking, okay, what's my peer doing? It's really getting those HCAPS scores up, right? Because how much is HCAPS worth to us in our value proposition from a reimbursement standpoint? 25% of the score. It's actually divided 25% equally now for experience, quality, cost containment, and so forth. It's 25% of the score. What else?
Quality.
Safety scores. Yep. Our leapfrog stuff. What about productivity? Is it benchmarked internally?
Now that you say it, yeah.
Have you not figured me out by now? I'm telling you that.
When you said it earlier, I didn't think about it that way, but yeah, because we.
Where's Benchmark?
In
ClickView.
ClickView.
Exactly.
And it's in
I didn't
ClickView.
even think about it.
Yes.
And you look at it every
You
day.
have a whole gamut of comparative data around what your productivity score was, how much PTO you're using, how much agency labor you got employed in your organization, in your department, and so forth.
for your vacancy.
How likely are you to get a raise?
Oh, yeah.
How
Yeah.
likely are you to get an approval?
But-
Right.
Yeah, no, in all seriousness, but within that, we all know that we have pockets of best practice in our organization, right? So as you look at that comparative data, it could be that, well, TK, explain to me, I mean, I've looked at your HCAP scores and your productivity, and you're hitting 110% productivity, but what would we intuitively think about? Everybody say, hey, ET. What would you think intuitively if you're running a really high productivity score like that? What's intuitive in your mind? You're running your nurses staff, you're managing your staff, and you would expect what? Your HCAP score to tank,
Right.
right? But let's say in theory, TK's got 110% productivity and she's hitting 92 on her
Jesus.
responsiveness.
I receive it.
Speak it.
And you see this from a benchmark standpoint, and she sustains this.
Right.
What would I do if I
You would
wanted
be
to?
like,
Reach
I would
out.
call
What are you
TK.
doing?
We gotta have a talk,
Right.
right? That's my point. Use ClickView more than just measurement of productivity. You can, when you decipher the data, I look in it all the time, and I see pockets of opportunity all the time. And I actually do call the manager every once in a while and go, all right, what are you doing? Because I'll give you an example right now. Patrick is fairly new in the ED, right? Anybody want to guess what his productivity scores are right now? 112%. It went from low 80s, 112%. Are people running out the door at the ED right now? What's their retention rate? It's actually stable. Okay, there's an example. Being able to use the system, see a change, benchmark against your peers, and then go have a conversation and learn something. So those are some examples. There's our internal benchmarking system. If you have any questions about it, I use it all the time. I'm happy to walk you through how to pull data out of it, how to extract it. I pull it to Excel all the time and use this information. It's pretty easy to do, so just let me know on that.
So how can we, I know I look at this all the time, I'm sure all of us in this room here. What is, you think, a best way for us to be able to break this down to our staff so that they can make this usable for them? I'm always trying to think in my mind, how can I make sure that this connects with them so that they understand?
Yep, what's important to your staff? Why does a nurse come to work on the unit every day? Well,
No, to take care of patients and to get.
we all got into this for a while. I know why I got
To
into it.
take care of
Because I love taking
Because
care
you
of
love
people.
patients, you love people.
Right. So it has to translate to the story of what's important to them with respect to the data. Because from an operational standpoint, we want them to work for a great organization that can sustain them and take care of that. That story translates to the fact that we have to have the money to help do that, right? And this is the message I actually give, and I told you $20 million. This is how I translate that. If we do these little things right around productivity every day, and we do it consistently, that's another big issue, we'll talk about it, and we've already kind of alluded to. Part of our job as managers is to make that environment very consistent. If I'm that nurse, do I want to come to work and work in an environment, when I talked about 13 calls in 12 hours, do I want to come to work and know that every day my environment's running like this and I know what to expect when I walk in the door, right? Or do I want to come in, would I rather